She bought an abandoned house next to a graveyard, hoping for a quiet new beginning. But behind one crumbling wall, she discovered a hidden door that hadn't been opened in 50 years. What waited beyond it wasn't just dust and darkness. It was a truth tied to a mystery of missing children and a past the entire town tried to forget. What happened inside this abandoned house shocked everyone. But before we dive in, tell us where are you watching from? We love seeing our global family in the comments. Let's get started. The moment Grace Holloway stepped out of her rusted car and looked up at the old farmhouse, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Quiet. Not the kind of silence that follows loss, she knew that silence well, but a kind of stillness that wraps around your ribs and makes you breathe again. She was 43, recently divorced, no kids, no one left to call her after 9 p.m., and after selling everything but her dog-eared journals and second-hand books, she bought this place a sagging 2-story house on the edge of Briar Hollow Cemetery. It came cheap, almost suspiciously cheap. The locals had whispered that land's cursed, but Grace wasn't afraid of curses. She was afraid of emptiness, so she moved in. The first night, she stood on the back porch, staring out at the gravestones scattered like broken teeth across the hill. Some were cracked, some just missing. All of them old. She whispered to no one in particular. "I'm not here to bother you. I just need a place to start over." And if the wind shifted just right, it felt like something hurt her. Grace Holloway wasn't expecting much from the house, just 4 walls, a roof that didn't leak too much, and quiet. What she didn't expect was the notes. The first one showed up on a rainy Wednesday. She'd just come in from stacking firewood behind the shed, soaked to the bone and freezing. She kicked off her muddy boots and shuffled into the kitchen, only to stop cold. There it was, a single folded paper sitting neatly on the kitchen table, the same table she'd just wiped down that morning. She frowned. There hadn't been any mail. No one had visited. She lived alone. Hands trembling slightly, she opened it. The handwriting was sharp and rushed, only 4 words. "You shouldn't be here." Her breath hitched. She turned around instinctively, expecting someone to be behind her. Nothing. Just the sound of the rain tapping against the windows and the ticking of the crooked wall clock. That night, Grace couldn't sleep. She sat in the armchair by the front window, sipping cold tea, the note clutched in her lap. She tried to reason with herself. Maybe it had been stuck in an old drawer and fallen out somehow. But it was too fresh. The edges weren't yellowed. The ink hadn't faded. At 2:47 a.m., she finally dozed off. At 3:12, she woke up gasping. The back door was wide open. Over the next few days, more notes appeared. On the bathroom mirror. "Leave. Before it remembers." Inside the fridge, taped to a jar of strawberry jam. "Don't open the door." She didn't understand. What door? Grace started keeping a journal, writing down every detail, not just about the notes, but the house itself. She noticed small things, the way the hallway floor creaked near the bookshelf even when no one was there, the faint scent of roses that would drift in from the attic, even though it was boarded shut, the sound of footsteps behind her. That always stopped when she turned. She told herself it was just stress, the aftermath of a broken marriage, an old house playing tricks. But deep down, she knew better. This wasn't grief. This was something else. Then came the Sunday afternoon she found the hatch. She'd been cleaning the storage room at the back of the house, what she planned to turn into a little writing nook. Moving aside a heavy shelving unit, she noticed a patch of wall with a slightly different texture. Older, almost deliberately disguised. She tapped it. Hollow. And right in the center of the wall, beneath layers of peeling wallpaper, she saw it. A brass handle. Covered in dust, untouched, hidden. Her breath caught in her throat. She didn't open it that day. Instead, she sat in front of it for hours, legs crossed on the wooden floor, staring at the door in silence. Why hide a door in a house that had no secrets? Why warn her not to open it? And yet, it was like the door wanted to be found. That night, she dreamt of a child's voice whispering. We didn't leave. We were left behind. The next morning, a new note waited on the nightstand. Different handwriting this time. Softer, almost pleading. If you open it, please don't forget us. Grace didn't eat breakfast, didn't drink her coffee. She went straight to the hatch. This time, she didn't hesitate. Her fingers curled around the cold brass handle. The door gave a soft groan like something waking from sleep, and opened. It revealed a narrow passage, stone walls, old wooden beams overhead, dust thick in the air, and at the very end of it, a small iron door. Sealed! Her flashlight flickered. She stepped inside. Each step echoed, not loudly, but deeply, like sound being swallowed. The walls were lined with old wallpaper, peeling like dry skin. One patch held faded writing names, dozens of them, first names only, written in children's handwriting. Beneath each was a small red mark, like a tally. Grace felt her knees weaken. She reached the iron door and noticed a date etched into the surface. October 4th, 1973. Exactly 50 years ago. She tried the handle. It didn't move. But as she turned to leave, she noticed a wooden box on the floor, covered in dust, untouched for decades. Inside, there were photographs. Children, families, standing in front of the house. And behind them, the graveyard. But what shook her wasn't the faces. It was what had been scratched out. Every adult in every photo had their eyes marked through. Except for one, a woman, standing on the porch, hair pinned back, pale dress, and Grace recognized her, because it was her own face. She dropped the photo. The flashlight slipped from her hand, clattering to the stone floor. She stood there, heart pounding, staring at the photo that shouldn't exist. She wasn't just in the house. She had always been part of it. Somehow. And the door had remembered. Grace didn't sleep that night. She sat on the edge of her bed, the photo resting beside her like a question she couldn't answer. Why was her face in a photograph dated decades before she was born? Why had someone carefully scratched out every other adult and left her untouched? Outside, the wind howled against the window panes. The graveyard beyond the house was swallowed in fog. It felt like the whole valley was holding its breath. By morning, the air in the house had changed. It wasn't colder, it wasn't louder, but it was heavier. Like the house knew she had seen something she wasn't meant to. Grace moved through each room slowly, like someone walking through the ruins of a dream. Her hands brushed along old wallpaper, the curve of wooden banisters, the chipped corners of door frames. This place, once a simple fixer-upper, had become something else entirely. It was watching her now, not with malice, but with memory. That afternoon, she decided to return to the hidden passage. She brought gloves, a dust mask, her notebook, and a small recorder. She wanted to document everything. Maybe one day she'd laugh at herself for thinking she'd stepped into some ghost story. But as she reached the hatch, she noticed something chilling. The door was already open, and inside, on the floor by the wooden box of photos, was something new. A toy. A small, hand-carved wooden horse, the kind you'd find in the 1950s, worn smooth from age, one eye missing. Grace didn't touch it. Instead, she stepped farther into the passage, toward the sealed iron door at the end. But something was different this time. There was light bleeding through the cracks. She knelt down, heart racing, and placed her ear against the cold metal. And what she heard made her blood run cold. Children. Laughing. Not loudly, not joyfully, but that eerie, distant kind of laughter, the kind you might hear in a dream just before it turns into a nightmare. Then came a whisper. "She's here." Grace stumbled backward. The hallway pulsed with a sudden draft, cold and sour, like damp earth and old iron. The wallpaper fluttered behind her, and one by one, the names written on the walls began to smear, as if someone were wiping them away from the other side. Grace ran. Back in the kitchen, she collapsed into the chair by the window. She stared out at the graveyard, heart still pounding. Something inside her screamed to leave, to pack her bags and never look back. But another part of her, a quieter part, knew she couldn't. Because if she left now, whoever was behind that door would stay there, forgotten. Again, she looked back at the table. Another note. This time, folded neatly on her plate. She hadn't even heard it arrive. The paper was yellowed, older. But the handwriting was unmistakable. It was hers. "Don't let them erase us." Grace stared at the note, trembling. She didn't remember writing it. Didn't remember any of this. But deep inside her chest, a flicker of knowing stirred. That night, she dreamed, not of ghosts, but of herself, standing in the kitchen, younger, wearing a 70s floral dress, hair longer, pinned behind her ears. She held a candle in one hand, in the other, the wooden horse, and behind her, the iron door stood open. A child barefoot, with hollow eyes, stood in the threshold. He looked up at her and asked, "Will you come back this time?" Grace woke up sobbing. She spent the next day researching in dusty library archives, old town records, forgotten articles. She learned that in 1973, 7 children had gone missing from Briar Hollow in the span of 3 months, all from families that lived within a few miles of the graveyard. Only one connection between them had ever been documented. They all played near the Holloway farmhouse. The last child vanished on October 4th, the same date etched into the iron door. No one was ever charged. And shortly after, the property was abandoned. Grace felt the ground shift beneath her. She thought about her name, Holloway, and her grandfather's refusal to ever speak of his childhood home. She thought of the photographs, the scratched-out faces, the voice in her dream. Maybe she wasn't just living in this story. Maybe she was its ending. That night, she returned to the passage one more time. She lit candles along the hallway walls, laid the photos in a neat row, placed the wooden horse in front of the iron door, and then she spoke, not in fear, but in love. "I don't remember what happened, but I believe you were here, and I believe you were forgotten, and I won't let that happen again." The candles flickered wildly. The light behind the door grew stronger. Then came the sound, softer this time. Not laughter, not whispers, but a single voice, a child's voice. "Thank you, Grace." When she opened her eyes, the iron door was no longer sealed. It stood slightly ajar. Inside, only darkness and peace. Grace Holloway didn't step back from the iron door that night. She stood there for what felt like hours, staring into the dark space that had been sealed shut for half a century. And yet, as strange as it seemed, she didn't feel afraid. She felt welcome. It wasn't just a passage. It wasn't just a hidden room. It was a memory, solidified in stone and silence, waiting for someone to open it again. And somehow she knew it had been waiting for her. Inside, the air was cold, still, untouched. The small room beyond the iron door was circular, with walls built from thick stone and a domed ceiling that echoed even the softest breath. It felt like a chamber designed to keep something in, or something out. On the far wall, candle holders had been carved directly into the stone. The melted wax beneath them suggested someone had once come here, often sat here, grieved here, prayed here. In the center of the room stood a single wooden chair, facing an altar. And on that altar, resting beneath a layer of dust and time, was a stack of journals. Grace approached slowly. Her fingers hovered above the journals before she dared to touch them. The leather was cracked, but the ink inside still held strong. She opened the first one and saw the name written in large, careful script. Eleanor Holloway, 1971. Her breath caught. Eleanor, her grandmother's name. The woman her family never spoke about. The woman they called troubled. The woman who, according to family whispers, went mad and vanished. But now, holding her words in her hands, Grace didn't feel madness. She felt clarity. To whoever finds this, the first page read, "I am not crazy. They want you to think I am. But I've seen what this place remembers. The children come here in dreams. They whisper. They show me faces. And when I speak their names aloud, the candles light themselves. This room is not cursed. It's sacred. It holds everything we're too afraid to face." Grace flipped through page after page, drawings of gravestones, names of children, snippets of songs, lullabies. And again, Eleanor had written, "Don't let them be erased." Grace cried, not from fear, but from the unbearable weight of knowing. All this time, her grandmother hadn't been losing her mind. She'd been holding on to voices everyone else had ignored. She wasn't haunted. She was listening, just like Grace was now. That moment changed everything. Grace no longer looked at the house as a place that held secrets. She saw it as a vessel, a keeper, a witness. She began reading the journals daily. Each page pulled her deeper into the lives of the children who had vanished, the families who'd searched, the silences that had settled in their place. Some entries were frantic, others gentle. Some sounded like lullabies, others read like screams on paper. And through it all, Grace began to feel like she was no longer living alone. She started speaking their names aloud each night. "Standing in front of the iron door," she would say. "Michael, Ruth, Danny, Elias, Sarah, Lena, Tommy." And with each name, she'd light a candle. And every time, every single time, the room would grow warmer. As if a piece of each child was still here, waiting, watching, hoping not to be forgotten. She made changes to the house too. She opened the windows every morning, letting light spill across floorboards that had been dark for years. She repainted the walls not to hide the past, but to honor it, in soft blues, warm grays, and pale yellows. She hung photos not just of her own life, but scans of the children's faces she'd found in town records and Eleanor's journals. She placed a sign in the front yard, "The Listening House," in memory of the forgotten. And slowly, word began to spread. People from the town began to visit. At first, just a few curious neighbors. Then, a local historian. A mother whose brother had disappeared in the 70s. A woman who said she used to play in the graveyard as a child until the whispers scared her away. They came with stories, with questions, with pain they had carried for decades. And Grace listened to them all. One afternoon, a man in his late 60s knocked on the door. He introduced himself as Tommy Rhodes. Grace's heart nearly stopped. "Tommy," she whispered, "you were one of the names." He nodded, eyes glossy. "I was supposed to disappear," he said, "but I ran. I ran so far I forgot who I was, but something called me back." He placed a faded photo on the table. It was of him, as a boy, standing in front of the Holloway house. And behind him, Eleanor, smiling. That night, Grace stood once more at the iron door. Only this time, she wasn't just the woman who found it. She was the continuation of everything it was built for. and with her voice steady, full, and no longer trembling, she whispered, "I remember you. I believe you. I will carry you forward." And in the silence that followed, she didn't feel alone. She felt surrounded, not by ghosts, not by fear, but by truth, by memory, and by a love that had waited 50 years to be spoken aloud again. The mailbox was never full before. Just bills, maybe a coupon flyer once in a while. But now, letters came from everywhere. Some addressed to Grace Holloway, others to the Listening House. A few didn't even have a name, just the address, scribbled on envelopes trembling with old handwriting. Inside were stories, confessions, questions, and sometimes apologies. I grew up near that cemetery. I remember the day Danny vanished. My aunt never forgave herself for not watching the children more closely. I was told to forget, but I couldn't. Thank you for remembering. Grace read every single one. She kept them in a wooden box she placed beneath the front window. Not locked away, but displayed, like offerings. Because now, this house wasn't just hers. It belonged to memory. Word began to spread beyond Briar Hollow. It started when a podcast producer emailed Grace after hearing whispers about the iron door. Then a local news station sent a quiet, respectful journalist who stayed for tea and cried beside the hidden room. Soon, people across the state knew her name, knew the story, and most importantly knew the names of the children that history tried to erase. Michael, Ruth, Danny, Elias, Sarah, Lena, and Grace added one more to that list, Eleanor. The woman who had tried to tell the truth long before anyone was ready to hear it. That's when the university called. A professor from the Department of Oral History had read Grace's handwritten submission to a regional archive. He asked, gently, if they could preserve the journals, digitize them, build a safe record of everything she'd uncovered, not to exploit, but to protect it. Grace agreed, but with one condition. You can scan the pages, but the originals stay in this house. The professor nodded, respectful. I think that's exactly where they belong, he said. Then came the grant. A woman named Mira, whose sister had vanished in 1972, worked with a non-profit that funded preservation for trauma sites tied to forgotten children. They offered full funding to restore the cellar, fortify the structure around the iron door, and install climate-controlled cases for the journals, toys, and letters. But Grace hesitated. This isn't a museum, she said. It's a voice. Mira smiled softly. Then let's help more people hear it. So the work began. Not construction. Transformation. Grace and a small group of volunteers, including Tommy Rhodes, now a permanent fixture in her kitchen every Tuesday, restored the altar room brick by brick. They didn't erase the names on the wall, they repainted them, in brighter colors, and next to each, a candle sconce. When lit together, it was like a constellation of memory, each name burning a little brighter with every visitor who entered. Grace turned the small back room into a remembrance library, not just filled with history books, but blank journals and colored pencils. Visitors were invited to write letters, draw memories, or simply sit in silence. Children would come and write messages like, I hope you're not scared anymore. You can play with me now. I think you were very brave. And one morning, Grace found a note slipped between 2 pages of Eleanor's journal. I'm 11. My mom says it's weird to talk to ghosts, but I think they hear me here. Thank you for making a place where I'm not crazy. Grace pressed the paper to her heart, then added it to the box. The most surprising opportunity came from the mayor's office. Briar Hollow, once a ghost town in spirit, if not in name, wanted to designate the house and graveyard as a protected heritage site. The mayor herself visited, stood in the altar room, and whispered, I grew up 2 streets away. We all knew something was wrong. We just didn't know how to help. Now, she said, they finally could. One chilly morning in March, Grace hosted the first remembrance gathering. Locals, strangers, historians, children, elders, they gathered beneath the massive oak tree between the house and the graveyard. Grace stood on the old stone porch and read aloud the first names from Eleanor's journal. Then, one by one, candles were placed on each marked grave. Some had names, some didn't. But all of them had light. As the final candle flickered to life, Grace looked out at the crowd. So many faces. Some she knew, some she didn't. And yet, they all stood together like threads finally being rewoven. That night, the house glowed differently. Not just from the candles. From the inside. The silence felt full, warm, not haunted, held. And as Grace stood once more in front of the iron door, now framed with photographs, names, and flowers left by kind strangers, she whispered, "We're still listening." And from deep within the stone, a breeze stirred. Not cold, not loud, just a sigh, like something ancient and tired, finally resting. Grace Holloway used to be afraid of quiet. After the divorce, after the long nights of staring at her kitchen wall clock and counting the ticks between silences, she believed that loneliness was a kind of slow drowning, that stillness was a void, that the absence of noise was the absence of meaning. But now, she had discovered a new kind of quiet, one that didn't smother, one that listened back. And in that sacred stillness, something inside her was healing. It began subtly. She found herself waking up before sunrise, not from anxiety, but anticipation. The morning light creeping across the wood floors felt like a gentle conversation. Not an intrusion. She started writing again, not just notes, not journals, letters. To Eleanor, to the children. To herself, versions of her that still lived in old, painful chapters. She'd sit in the remembrance library, pen in hand, and begin. Dear Grace, who was afraid. Dear Eleanor, I see you now. Dear Danny, I dreamed of your voice last night. One morning, she received a call from a young woman named Ruby, who had visited the house with her teenage brother 2 months earlier. I don't know if you remember us, Ruby said. He didn't say much at the time. Grace did remember. The boy had hovered near the hallway to the iron door but refused to step in. He had kept his head low, eyes down, hands stuffed in his hoodie pockets. I just wanted to tell you. Ruby continued, her voice trembling. He finally talked. After we visited your house, he told me something that happened to him when he was little. Something he was too scared to say before. There was a pause, a breath held. And now he's getting help. Grace pressed the phone to her ear, closing her eyes. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Ruby's last words cracked the silence. He said your house made him feel seen. That night, Grace stood by the iron door again. She didn't light candles. She didn't read from the journals. She simply stood there, hand resting gently on the doorframe, and whispered, You're not just helping me, you're helping them. We're doing this together. And in that moment, for the first time, she felt proud. Not of the preservation, not of the attention, but of the woman she was becoming. A woman who didn't run, who didn't hide, who stood beside the darkness and held out a light not to erase it, but to understand it. As the seasons shifted, so did Grace. Spring melted into summer, and the graveyard began to bloom. Children came to visit with their families, no longer with fear, but with questions. Grace started guiding small tours. Not as a curator, as a story keeper. She spoke with gentle certainty, her voice neither theatrical nor rehearsed, but personal, like she was telling a secret that needed to be told. Not shouted. She'd stand before the room behind the iron door, place a hand over her heart, and say, These are the children who trusted someone to listen. They may be gone, but their names are louder now than ever before. Then came the letter from her father. Grace hadn't heard from him in years, not since the divorce, not since she left the city. Their relationship had been a long string of silence, tension, and blame. He had called Eleanor delusional his entire life, had refused to speak of the farmhouse, had cut ties with everything tied to the Holloway name. But the envelope sat on her porch one morning. No return address, just her name in old, stiff handwriting. Inside was a single sheet of paper. I saw your interview. I read the article. I was wrong about your grandmother. I was wrong about you. Dad. Grace sat on the porch swing for over an hour, letter in hand. Tears streaming down her face, not the kind that erupt from pain, but the kind that finally come when you've waited too long to be understood. She didn't need him to be perfect. She just needed him to finally see her. That same evening, she visited Eleanor's journal and opened to a random page. I don't need them to fix me. I only need someone to believe I'm not broken. Grace smiled. For the first time, she felt that Eleanor, wherever she was, could finally rest. Because her voice had not just been heard, it had become a bridge. Later that summer, Grace stood at the edge of the cemetery for the unveiling of a new plaque. Dozens gathered. Some were descendants, some were strangers. All were witnesses now. The plaque read, "In memory of the forgotten, in honor of those who listened, may silence never be our legacy again." When it was her turn to speak, Grace stepped forward with a photo in hand, a black and white image of Eleanor, arms wrapped around two small children on the farmhouse porch. She looked out at the crowd, then said, "This isn't a haunted house. It's a house that waited for the right person to open the door, not to release ghosts, but to make space for the truth. And the truth is, we don't heal by forgetting. We heal by remembering together." The applause was soft. But in the quiet that followed, something strange happened. A sudden gust of wind rushed through the cemetery, knocking over not a single flower, but lifting a piece of folded paper from the steps of the porch. Grace walked over and picked it up. It was blank except for one line, written in Eleanor's old handwriting. "You finished what I started. Thank you, Grace." She folded the note, pressed it to her heart, and smiled. Not everything needed proof. Sometimes, the soul just knows when something has finally come full circle. And for the first time in decades, so did the house. The leaves turned golden just as they always had. Every fall, the wind would blow down from the hills behind the graveyard, curling through the broken stones and whispering through the grass. But that year, something was different. The house didn't creak the same. It didn't moan in the night like old homes often do. Instead, it hummed, softly, warmly, as if the wood and stone had learned to breathe again. Grace Holloway stood at the kitchen sink, washing a teacup. The window above it looked out over the cemetery, where the new memorial stood beneath the oak tree. The brass plaque caught the morning light like a beacon. Every now and then, she'd see someone walk the path to it. An older man clutching a photo, a young girl tracing the engraved names with her fingers, a mother standing alone, lips moving in prayer or apology. Grace never interrupted. Some grief needed privacy, some memories asked only to be felt. But every time someone left, they walked a little taller, a little freer. The iron door room was no longer hidden. It was now the heart room, as the children who visited liked to call it. And it truly had become that the beating center of a house once frozen in silence. Grace had placed Eleanor's photo near the entrance, alongside a small engraved quote. She listened when no one else did. Beneath it, visitors could leave letters, drawings, names. And they did. Thousands, by now. One day, a young boy named Theo visited the house on a school field trip. He was quiet, stoic in a way too heavy for his age. while the other kids laughed and whispered about ghosts. Theo stood still in the heart room, hands in his pockets, staring at the candle-lit names on the wall. Grace approached slowly. "You okay?" she asked. He nodded, then paused. "My brother, he died," he whispered. "No one really talks about him anymore." Grace knelt beside him. "Would you like to write him a letter?" He nodded again. They sat at the small wooden desk in silence while he scribbled, tongue between his teeth. Tears streaming but unacknowledged. He folded the note, walked to the altar, and placed it gently beneath Eleanor's journal. Then he looked at Grace and said something she'd never forget. "This place makes people remember on purpose." Later that night, Grace sat in the library, watching the flame in the lantern flicker. Outside, crickets chirped in the trees. The house was quiet, not the kind of quiet she once feared. This was a quiet that held stories. And in that quiet, she thought of everyone who had passed through these rooms, everyone who had once felt forgotten. She picked up her pen and began to write. To the next keeper of this house. She didn't know when she'd pass it on. Maybe not for years. Maybe not until she was gray and tired and ready to rest. But the thought didn't scare her. Because this house didn't belong to her. It belonged to all who were willing to listen. As the year came to a close, the town of Briar Hollow held its first official Day of Remembrance. They lined the cemetery in lanterns, told stories aloud around a fire pit, invited the community to read names, some new, some ancient, some still unsolved. Grace was asked to speak. She didn't prepare a script. She never did. Instead, she stood in front of the crowd, the flames dancing across their faces, and said, "This house gave me back more than I ever lost. It gave me voices I didn't know I needed. It gave me purpose I never asked for. And in return, I gave it what it always deserved. To be seen, to be heard, to be held." Her voice cracked on the last word, but she didn't apologize. Because everyone in the crowd was crying too. As the crowd began lighting candles, Grace felt a hand slip into hers. She turned and saw her father. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. He stood beside her, eyes glistening, finally sharing the weight he had once carried in silence. They lit a candle together. For Eleanor, for the children, for the past that refused to die quietly. That night, after the last guest had left, Grace walked through the house one last time, room by room. She paused at every creak, every photograph, every corner where dust used to gather but now held flowers or stories. And when she reached the heart room, she sat in the wooden chair beneath the dome and whispered into the air, "We did it." And for the first time, the room whispered back. It wasn't a word, not even a sound. It was a feeling, like the warm hand of someone long gone, gently placed on your shoulder. Months later, a young woman named Annie wrote to her. She had no family, had been in and out of shelters, had read about the listening house in a local paper. Grace invited her to visit. They walked the garden, talked over tea, and by sunset, Annie turned to her and said, "I've never had a home that felt like it wanted me to stay." Grace smiled. "Well, this house has room for anyone who wants to remember." Annie didn't leave that night, or the next. She stayed, and learned, and listened. And one quiet morning, Grace placed the keys to the heart room in Annie's palm. "You'll know what to do," she said. Because she did. Because this story had never been just hers. It was shared by every soul who had ever been silenced, by every heart brave enough to break open, by every whisper waiting to be heard. Somewhere beyond the graveyard, a soft wind stirred the leaves. The house stood steady, warmed from within, holding memory, carrying truth. And through its walls, the quiet never sounded more alive. Not everyone is called to change the world. But sometimes, the world changes because one person decides to listen. As the last candle flickered in the heart room and the shadows settled across the graves of Briar Hollow, Grace Holloway closed the journal she once feared to open, not to bury the past, but to make room for the voices of those still waiting to be heard. This story was never just about ghosts or mystery. It was about memory, about belonging, about what happens when one woman dares to sit with silence and answer back with love. The woman who once came searching for a place to hide had become the guardian of a truth too long buried. And now, this house once forgotten belongs to every child who was silenced, every elder who still remembers, and every heart that refuses to walk away from the pain of others. Because for Grace and for those who will follow her path, remembrance isn't the end. It's the beginning. The end. Up next, 2 more stories that will move you to your core. Click to keep listening with us, and don't forget to hit subscribe if you believe that some stories deserve to be remembered forever.